So I don't know if you guys heard, but there's this guy, his name was Che Guevara, and he was apparently a very bad guy. He's a very mean guy. He had this blender. It was called El Blender. He had it in his fortress in Cuba, where, again, he would do mass executions, by the way. But in that fortress, in that execution chamber, he had this blender. It was called El Blender. And what he would do was he would go throughout the countryside and find newborn babies. That was his favorite thing to do. He would frolic along the countryside, go in through villages and say, oh, was that a newborn baby? He could smell them, actually. He had like the nose like a bloodhound. He could smell them from miles away. He would go into villages and he would just extract the babies, take them, bring them back to his fortress, and then he would go up to El Blender and he would put them in and he would make a baby smoothie. That's something that Che Guevara used to do. I don't know if you knew that. Another thing he would do is he had this pirate ship. It was called El Pirate Ship. And he would just kind of like take it for little rides off the coast of Havana. And whenever he had leftover babies, say El Blender couldn't fit all of the babies that he stole, he would take them on El Pirate Ship and he would make them walk El Plank. He'd say, hey, a walk the plank. I give him an Italian accent. I don't know how to do a Spanish one, I'm sorry. So that is kind of who we're dealing with now. That is Che Guevara. That is what the gracious and beautiful and well-meaning CIA took away from us. That is the favor that they did for us. They took away the man who owned El Blender and El Pirate Ship and El Plank, I guess, because he owned El Pirate Ship. All right, so Che Guevara. A lot of you guys know that I very much love Che Guevara. I think he might have been the coolest dude ever. And a lot of the shit that people say about him is just bullshit. It's very exaggerated. It's like literally what I just said about El Blender. That is the degree of shit that we're dealing with when we're dealing with anti-Che Guevara slander. So over the week, someone sent me the link to some Instagram reel, sent it to my email. I opened it up and it was like your typical anti-Che Guevara slop. Like, oh, he's racist. He did this, he did that. And they asked me, they're like, hey, could you off the cuff react to this on stream? And I was like, you know what? Any excuse I have to talk about El Blender, I am jumping at the bid. This guy right here, the Sagnik Basu, made this video about Che Guevara. It was actually about Jay-Z wearing a Che Guevara shirt, which is very funny for Jay-Z to be wearing because, I mean, Jay-Z is like a hyper capitalist billionaire guy. I don't know what the fuck he's doing, but I mean, whatever. And this individual over here makes a video talking about all of this shit that Che Guevara supposedly did, and it's not good. It's not good. If you're familiar with my work and my output, you probably know all of these talking points already, and you've probably seen me combat them many times, but it doesn't hurt to do it again.
Jay-Z wearing a Che Guevara shirt. And here's what Che said about black people. We are going to do for blacks exactly what blacks did for the revolution. Nothing.
So right off, like we're like 2 seconds in and he's already fucking speaking out of his ass. But it's really interesting how people will always bring up the same quotes when it comes to Che Guevara. One of the famous ones is the one that I did a whole video on, debunking that quote. It's attributed to Che, but he didn't actually say it. It's completely made up. Something about being a cold killing machine and killing people against the execution wall with no trial. I did a whole video on it. My brain's not working right now. Go watch it if you want. But what I ended up finding when I examined and I researched the origin of that quote was it was spliced together by taking a bunch of random, unsubstantiated quotes created by people like Humberto Fontova, who is like this nutjob author. This random author who used to write books about shooting boars and like hunting, who ended up pivoting into this like anti-Cuba propagandist. And he wrote multiple books where he just makes up a whole bunch of random shit about Che Guevara. And through his delusions, the random quotes that he attributes to Che, you get this amalgamation, this really damning amalgamation that is attributed to Che. And it states that Che said that, oh yeah, he executes people without trial and he fucking is a mass murderer or whatever. Now, that quote, it's not real. I did a whole video proving that it's not real. You could even go on Wiki Quotes and they'll say, this quote cannot be substantiated. There's no record of Che Guevara actually saying this. But this is a phenomenon when it comes to Che Guevara. You have like this Che Guevara supposed quote industrial complex where some random like Cuban expat, some random Cuban diaspora dude will say something and say that Che Guevara said it, and then all of a sudden that becomes fact. And then people like Ben Shapiro make YouTube videos repeating the fake quote with no proof of where it actually came from.
Che Guevara said, there's a direct quote from Che, this piece of crap who you see people walking around with his face on t-shirts. It's like walking around, again, with a Stalin t-shirt. He said, to send men to the firing squad, judicial proof is unnecessary, is what Che Guevara said. These procedures are an archaic, bourgeois detail. This is a revolution, and a revolutionary must become a cold-killing machine motivated by pure hate. We must create a pedagogy of the paradigm. That's the execution wall.
And then all of a sudden, it just kind of just gets sent into quote repositories like Goodreads. But then again, WikiQuote is actually pretty good at this because they'll say, this is not real. And funnily enough, the quote that we're looking at right now, we're going to do for blacks exactly what blacks did for the revolution, by which I mean nothing, that's also listed on the WikiQuote quote repository. And you want to know what WikiQuote says? We're going to do for blacks what blacks did for the revolution, by which I mean nothing, unclear origin, no sources. It's not real. Okay, this is the quote I was trying to think of earlier. To send men to the firing squad, judicial proof is unnecessary. These procedures are an archaic bourgeois detail. This is a revolution, and a revolutionary must become a cold killing machine motivated by pure hate. We must create the pedagogy of the paradon, the execution wall. So you know where this comes from. This comes from Humberto Fontova's Che Guevara, Assassin and Bumbler. That's where this quote comes from. And if you actually read Che Guevara, Assassin and Bumbler, do you know the context in which this quote comes? It comes in this context. So Fontova is writing about Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And he says, Lewis Carroll's world is so crazy. It's a world where people can get sentenced to death without a trial or whatever. That's what he's saying about Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. It's a wacky world. And then he goes on to say in this essay, Che Guevara, Assassin and Bumbler, he goes on to paint this hypothetical reality where Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, time travels to 1959 Cuba and hypothetically overhears Che Guevara say this: to send men to the firing squad, judicial proof is unnecessary. So this quote where Che Guevara apparently said this, its origin is this essay by Humberto Fontova, and the way it's originally presented in this essay is a hypothetical reality where Lewis Carroll time travels to Cuba. This is a guy who died in the 1800s. Time travels to Cuba and overhears Che Guevara say this. So he never said it. It's a hypothetical reality that was concocted in this random essay by some fucking psychopath. That is that quote. And that quote is constantly regurgitated as though Che Guevara actually said it when he didn't. He didn't say it. And the same holds true for this. We're going to do for blacks what blacks did for the revolution, by which I mean nothing, is not true. There's no origin, there's no sources, there's no way to prove that Che said this. So what we can do instead is we can look at his actual actions, right? We can look at what he did. So if you want to talk about that, fine. Let's look at what he did. But the first thing I will say to preface before we get into this, he did say something racist when he was like 22 years old, when he was writing the motorcycle diaries before he was a Marxist, when he was just kind of a rich Argentine kid, and he went on his trip throughout Latin America on his motorcycle. And that trip, funnily enough, is what actually radicalized him, because he saw the poverty and he saw the scars of imperialism on his continent. That is what kind of woke him up and turned him Marxist, was that trip. But before that, before he had that awakening, he was a spoiled, rich, white kid from Argentina. And in his motorcycle diaries, he did say something racist about a black person. He said they were like indolent or lazy or something. And this is when he was 22. He became a Marxist. He didn't do anything racist after that. You know what actually he did do? Was he did the inverse. One of the first things he and Castro did after the Cuban Revolution was desegregate all aspects of public and private life. This was as soon as they came to power. Because keep in mind, once they came to power in the revolution in 59, there was still segregation. There were vestiges of racism all over Cuba, despite the fact that Fulgencio Batista, the US-backed dictator that they deposed, was actually part black himself. But he didn't desegregate. It was Che and Castro who really pushed that forward. Che Guevara also went to the Congo to help stir revolution. He famously went to the Congo to try and stir revolution when he didn't have to. He could have stayed in Cuba after the revolution and enjoyed a cozy life, a cozy government job forever. He could have done that, but he said, no, the people in Congo need help with a revolution. I want to help them with a revolution, okay? And he went and he sacrificed himself and his body and his potential safety to go and help them because he cared about them. This is not something that someone who is a virulent anti-black racist would do. Really? If I was a virulent anti-black racist, why would I say I'm disgusted by what's happening to the people of Congo and I'm going to risk my life to go help them? Why would I do that? It's just crazy. He also famously denounced apartheid at the UN. He did that speech. He also wrote a letter to William Morris of Miami, Florida in 1959, and I can read it to you. You tell me if this sounds like something a racist would write. Esteemed sir, I received your letter to pass on to our commander-in-chief, which I have done, but I would like to say that if any vestiges of racial discrimination remain in this country, our revolution will put a complete end to them. Keep in mind, he wrote this right after the revolution was successful in 1959. You can be absolutely sure that within a few years, any difference between white and black will be solely a question of skin color, as it should be. This is on page 189 of I Embrace You with All My Revolutionary Fervor. Okay, this is a letter that Che Guevara sent in 1959. Is this the sound of an anti-black racist? Like, don't get me wrong, there are mistakes the guy made, okay? He was a white dude in the 50s. He was not going to be as sensitive as people are today. I'll be the first to admit that. And Che and Castro, like, there were mistakes that they made, right? So prior to the revolution, there were kind of like these groups of, say, black people who were connected on the grounds of specific places of origin in Africa. That was something that was prevalent in Cuba, and it was like these kind of communities. And Castro didn't like this because he thought, well, we need to align people on the basis of class and internationalism and come together and put behind these vestiges of racism and racial compartmentalization. That was Castro's mindset when it came to that. Now, obviously, class reductionism has its issues. And one of the issues is it doesn't speak to the unique experiences experienced by black people. That's something that I don't think white people can fully understand in the same way, regardless of how much you boil things down to just class analysis. Class analysis is very important. Obviously, I'm a Marxist, that's what I believe. But at the same time, you can't boil everything down to this class reductionist outlook because it leaves out specific and unique experiences that you can't really understand to the degree that you need to understand them. How are white people supposed to understand the very unique lived experience of black people in Cuba? Cuba was known for being hyper racist. Of all the Latin American countries, Cuba was of the most racist. It was the second last to abolish slavery. I think the last was Brazil. But Cuba didn't formally abolish slavery until, I think, 1886. So this is a racial slave state. I don't think it's smart to come in here and say, okay, we align solely on the basis of class now without trying to understand the specific experiences of black people who suffered immensely in Cuba. So that is where I would say there was an issue. But again, that's very different than deliberately thinking, okay, black people are inferior to me, I'm being racist, I don't like these people. The reason Castro did that was because he thought that he was actually doing the right thing, and this would actually cause people to become less racist because they would align on class. That's very different than being a racist. It was a mistake, but it wasn't a malicious manifestation of Castro's racism, you know?
I'm going to give Jay-Z the benefit of the doubt and hope he did not know that Che Guevara was a racist, homophobic thug.
We just covered the racist stuff. The homophobic stuff, when he was writing the Motorcycle Diaries, same thing. Before he was a Marxist, before he was an internationalist, before he saw what imperialism did to his continent, before he understood they're all in this together, he didn't have that mindset yet, right? So before he acquired that mindset, before he became a Marxist, yeah, he said something homophobic. I think he called a gay guy perverted or something. He was a 22-year-old guy who said something homophobic in like the 50s. Probably before that, actually.
That's just some of his highlights. He killed prisoners without a trial.
Wrong. He did not kill prisoners without a trial. Funnily enough, Che Guevara was known for actually being very careful. He made sure that all the evidence was seen, all of the witnesses were heard before issuing death sentences to the fascists of the Batista regime. So Che was tasked with overlooking the tribunals after the Cuban Revolution. So the dynamic on the ground after the Cuban Revolution is you had obviously the successful revolutionaries, and then you had the remnants of the Batista regime, the tyrannical Batista regime, the officers, the soldiers who were very well known, famous for torturing, raping, mutilating Cuban civilians. So the dynamic on the ground in Cuba post-revolution was you had the citizenry basically saying, we want justice. We want these people to be tried. We want the full extent of the law to be brought down on these people. That was the dynamic on the ground. Che Guevara actually acted as a moderating force here. He was the one who said, you guys are calling for blood. We can't do that. I need to see the witnesses. I need to see all of the evidence. You could even see other judges who sat on the appellate bench who corroborate this. They say, no, we were actually very careful. We weighed all of the evidence. We did not just willy-nilly kill everybody. And if you want to be able to corroborate this with a scholar, read John Lee Anderson's book. John Lee Anderson, for those who don't know, is a scholar on Che Guevara who had unprecedented access into documents and archives about him, about his life. That is who John Lee Anderson is. He is so well respected and so knowledgeable when it comes to Che Guevara. He actually helped find Che Guevara's remains. That's how much he knows about this. That is how well versed he is on this topic. Unprecedented access to the archives, to documents. That is what his scholarship is predicated on, John Lee Anderson. So if you read his book, you can corroborate this. Che was very careful. He was not just killing people without trial at all. He actually had trials for all of these people. He was fighting the mobs. He was fighting the citizenry that said, no, we want blood because these people that are up for death sentence tortured, raped, and mutilated us. The death sentence would befall those people in any other country, by the way. And this isn't a commentary on whether or not I like the death sentence. I'm not a fan of it. This was in the 50s and 60s, okay? Death sentence just kind of happened. Other countries had it too. It's weird to single out Cuba as though it was the only country to have a death sentence. And that's not even the argument that these people make. The argument that these people make is that they were extrajudicially murdered. Che was just lining people up fucking ba-ba-ba-ba. That's what they try and make it seem like, but that's not what happened at all. And the kicker, the real kicker, is the tribunals that passed death sentences only dealt with Batista's soldiers and military men, militants, not civilians. So what this means is only people guilty of crimes such as like rape and murder and torture were eligible for the death sentence. And you can corroborate that by reading historian Paco Ignacio Taibo II's book on Che Guevara. I believe it's called Guevara, also known as Che. It's a really good book, but he goes over this. He talks about how the tribunals that had the ability to issue death sentences only dealt with militants, not civilians. There's another thing that I wanted to show you guys. So John Lee Anderson, aforementioned John Lee Anderson, he gave an interview to PBS, and he specifically dealt with this topic of apparently Che Guevara being some sort of mass murderer. This is what John Lee Anderson had to say, the scholar, the foremost scholar on this topic. I have yet to find a single credible source pointing to a case where Che executed an innocent. Those persons executed by Guevara or on his orders were condemned for the usual crimes punishable by death at times of war or in its aftermath: desertion, treason, or crimes such as rape, torture, or murder. I should add that my research spanned 5 years and included anti-Castro Cubans among the Cuban-American exile community in Miami and elsewhere. So this is the foremost scholar on Che Guevara, and this is some fucking idiot, okay? You pick your poison. You pick which one you want to trust.
While he was racist against black Cubans, he
Dude, how many times he keeps saying these racist about black? I feel like I've debunked that argument like 3 times already. He's racist against black Cubans, shows an image of Che Guevara going to the Congo, sacrificing his life to fight and stir up revolution because he wanted what was best for the people of Congo. And he's like holding a baby. He's like, this is the guy who's racist.
said Congolese fighters are culturally unfit.
No, he didn't. He was pessimistic about the revolution in Congo because of a lack of discipline. It had nothing to do with the race of the people he was working with, nothing to do with Congolese people. It wasn't a condemnation of Congolese people as a whole. It was just the fact that his fellow guerrillas at that point in time weren't yet ready for revolution. That was what he said. He did not make some sort of blanket condemnation of black people or Congolese people at all.
For revolution, he built labor camps for gay Cubans.
Oh my God. He did not build labor camps for gay Cubans. Typically, this line of argument is referring to the UMAPs. The UMAPs. Okay, so what were the UMAPs? After the revolution, Cuba, since it was technically in a state of war, Cuba had like a draft, a military draft. Like you had to help out in the military and help secure the revolution. But if you couldn't fight and aid the revolutionary effort, then you had to help in other ways. And that's why the UMAPs were created. It was like these camps, like labor camps, for people who could not serve in the military and had to help the revolutionary effort in some other way. So in those UMAPs, that's where you had people doing their part and making up for the fact that they couldn't serve in the military. Gay people in Cuba could not serve in the military at that time, which is fucked up, but that's just how it was. That's how it was pretty much anywhere else in the world. Gay people were not allowed to serve in the military. So because they weren't allowed to serve in the military, and the UMAPs existed for people who were not allowed to serve in the military to help the revolution in a different way, then gay people ended up in the UMAPs to help out the revolutionary effort. That's how that happened. It wasn't some sort of explicit camp built for gay people, as this complete fucking moron said. That's not what happened. That's the first point. The second point that's probably really important to note here is the UMAP system was created and built after Che Guevara already left Cuba. He was in Congo. He left. So after he left, that's when the UMAP system was created. So you can actually go and read Che Guevara's farewell letter to Castro, and you could see the date of that letter, and you could see the date that the UMAP system was created, and you could see that Che wasn't even there. He was gone before it was even up and operational. So there was no labor camps for gay people. That's a complete misrepresentation of what happened. There is something actually worth mentioning here. The gay people who did find themselves in the UMAP system, again, not because they were gay, but because they couldn't help the war effort and had to help the revolution in another way, but the gay people who found themselves in those camps were subjected to discrimination from other people in the camps. I guess just homophobia and discrimination. That's something that exists everywhere. It existed then, it exists now. So those people were discriminated against, and that's unacceptable. It's completely unacceptable. And Castro, actually many years later, came out and said that it was completely unacceptable. He apologized, and he said any wrong that came upon gay people in the UMAP system is completely his fault. He should have been more responsible and he should have made sure that it never happened, and he's deeply sorry that it ever did happen. He said he takes full responsibility for any harm that came upon a gay person when he should have been taking care of them and watching out for them. So this is what actually happened. Okay, it wasn't some sort of weird forced labor camp for gay people. That's not what happened. It was the UMAP system for people who couldn't serve in the military. Gay people couldn't serve in the military, and they happened to be subject to discrimination when they were in those camps. And Fidel, once he found out about it, took full responsibility, said he should have done more to prevent that, and was regretful that it actually happened. Said he was sorry that it happened. That's what actually happened. So when you hear the actual reality of the matter, and you contrast it with this fictionalized version of events that this moron is putting forth, it doesn't seem so pernicious anymore, right? It seems like, okay, it's not great what happened, but it's very different than specifically building labor camps for gay people. Like, that's complete bullshit. That just didn't happen. And again, Che Guevara wasn't even there when they were up and operational. He was gone before they were up and operational.
He said homosexuality is incompatible with revolutionary values.
I don't know where he said this. I can't find any instance of him saying this. It is worth saying that Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and a lot of men of that era, they had what John Lee Anderson says, like this Latin machismo. That's what he writes about in his Che Guevara biography, the one that I was referring to earlier. And Che and Castro, when they were young, sure. Do I think they were the most receptive to the plight of gay people or to the plight of women? I'm sure they were misogynistic and had this kind of machismo attitude, and that was a problem back then. It was a problem back then across the board. It's still a problem today. Like misogyny, homophobia, this is still a problem today. But the thing is, at least in the case of Castro, he grew, he aged, and he apologized. Che Guevara died before he could do that. But if all we're going off is, I guess, that homophobic thing Che wrote when he was 22 in the Motorcycle Diaries, it's really hard to say that Che Guevara was a virulent homophobe because we don't really have a big enough sample size to confirm or deny that claim. All we know is he's a guy who dedicated his life to the people, to fighting for what he thought was right, and he died doing that. So we don't actually know.
He shut down press, free elections, and labor unions. We live in an
All right, freedom of press was dangerous. They had to shut it down. Sorry. When you are under siege, when you are under threat from the largest empire in history, in human history, right at your doorstep, right fucking up the street, yeah, sorry, you're going to take wartime efforts. Cuba is in a state of war. What happened to the US when they were in a state of war? What happened was FDR, liberal darling, rounded up Japanese people and interned them. Is that freedom of speech? Well, that happened in the liberal democracy, the US, that this guy loves so much. The uncomfortable and unfortunate truth of the matter is, Cuba has always only experienced a state of war. When you are experiencing a state of war, certain liberal freedoms get put on the back burner. That's unfortunate, but that happens everywhere, including in the US, as I just mentioned. And also, Cuba, for the most part, is actually very progressive when it comes to this stuff. But again, they didn't have freedom of speech the way that the Americans understand it. And there's a reason for that. It was dangerous. If you look at Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, who was overthrown by the American government at the behest of the United Fruit Company because he did some reforms, liberal reforms. Jacobo Arbenz was not some communist. He did some land reforms. He tried to compensate and did compensate the landowners, the foreign companies that owned Guatemalan land, and he used their own tax forms to figure out how much they were owed. And he was overthrown by Eisenhower in Operation PB Success in '54. So if he was overthrown because he left open those liberal openings and those doors for dissent and publications and propaganda to fester and ultimately culminate in his overthrow, and Che Guevara would point to that because Che Guevara was in Guatemala when that happened, it makes sense for when Che Guevara and Castro find themselves in a position where they can implement a project that would uplift the living conditions of millions of people, which they did do in Cuba. It makes sense for them to be extra careful and say, well, in the case of Arbenz, who tried to do something less radical than us, he was overthrown and he wasn't clamping down in certain areas where he should have, especially at least temporarily, to implement his vision, to implement his project, because if that project was fully implemented and carried out, it would have resulted in the improvement of the living conditions for millions of people. And what happened to Arbenz when he was overthrown was the Mayan genocide. So if your options are, you had Arbenz who clamped down on the press temporarily so that he could put forth his vision and fend off American aggression, or Carlos Castillo Armas who then carries out genocide, sorry, fucking turn off the press. Sorry. Okay? So that's their logic. That's their logic in Cuba. And there's a reason why Cuba lasted so long. There's a reason the Americans were unable to overthrow it. And you know they tried. Lord knows they tried hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. You had Operation Mongoose, which was a bunch of sabotage missions to try and overthrow Castro. You had the Bay of Pigs, invasion. You had the bombings of Cuba. You had expats constantly doing terrorism of Cuba. They had to keep a tight grip on the country. Okay? If they didn't keep a tight grip of the country, they would have ended up like Jacobo Arbenz. They would have ended up like Salvador Allende. Salvador Allende is another great example. Allende left open all of these liberal openings. He was very diligent to stay as democratic as possible when he was implementing his democratic socialist vision, his Chilean road to socialism. And what ended up happening was the Americans exploited those liberal openings, the very same liberal openings that the Americans lament when they don't exist in places like Cuba. The Americans exploited them in Guatemala and Chile and overthrew Arbenz and overthrew Allende. And in the case of Allende, when he was overthrown and he was replaced by the junta that eventually devolved into the rule of Augusto Pinochet tortured and killed thousands of people for years to come. So again, if my options were Allende could have clamped down a little bit on those liberal openings and it wouldn't have resulted in a mass casualty event at the hands of Pinochet, then sorry, I'm all for it. Isaac, you're against capital punishment. Why? I feel like we don't utilize it enough. China does it right. So my argument against capital punishment is not necessarily that I think it's bad to take out like Batista militants. That's not my argument. My argument is there's a chance that innocent people can be killed by the state that way. And that does happen, right? So for me, if there's even a slight chance that an innocent person can be put to death by the state for something they didn't do, I don't want to go down that route. That's my argument. It's not because I think like the sanctity of the life of a fascist is fucking great or whatever. I don't give a shit. My big concern here is that I'm very worried that innocent people can die that way. That's why I don't advocate for it. All right.
Era where we tear down statues of historical figures for their sins, yet we give a free pass to communist icons.
Yeah, based. Fuck yeah.
Who were objectively worse. We scrubbed the Land Lakes Butter Lady, I'm so mad about that, and
why?
Aunt Jemima off the shelves for being offensive, but we put this piece of shit's face on our t-shirts.
Dude, this guy, literally every argument he made to substantiate the claim that Che is a piece of shit was false, was literally fell flat in like 2 seconds of me debunking it. So I don't know what the fuck this guy's talking about. He can't substantiate anything. The first thing he did in this video was put forth a fake quote. We're going to do for blacks what blacks did for the revolution, by which I mean nothing. This is one of the most famous fake Che Guevara quotes ever. All he had to do was go to like the most easily accessible quote repository, like wiki quotes, and within 2 scrolls, he would see, yeah, this is a fake quote, no source, unclear origin. I don't know who the fuck this guy is. I beg of him, someone please ask him to come on the stream. I really want to talk to him. Please. Please bring him on.
Why? Because as long as someone is fighting against the empire, our mainstream culture is willing to excuse their atrocities.
That's so funny because like historically people fighting against the empire are not excused. They're constantly branded as terrorists, even though the conception of terrorism is not applicable to anti-colonial resistance, but it's always, that paradigm is always imposed onto people who are fighting empire, who are fighting imperialism and colonialism. That paradigm of terrorism is constantly applied to them. It's just ridiculous. The idea that we give people a pass for fighting empire. If that was the case, it would not be illegal for me in Canada to say something positive about Hamas or Hezbollah or I don't know about the Houthis. I don't know if the Houthis is considered a terrorist organization anymore in Canada. Regardless, point still stands. People who are actually fighting against empire, blemishes and all, wrongs and all, are still engaging in anti-colonial resistance, and no matter where they are constantly and consistently branded terrorists. ANC in South Africa, terrorists. The FLN, terrorists. The idea that you can wage a struggle against an empire and resist imperialism without being branded a terrorist is ridiculous. This guy is a child. This guy has the mental faculties of a child. I really want him to come on the show. Someone please ask him.
The only people who know about Che's evil are the Cuban expats in Miami, while
the only people who know about, dude, does this guy not know like Latin Americans who stayed in Latin America? Like my girlfriend's family, they come from, they're Chilean and they lived in Cuba for a long time after Pinochet expelled and killed everyone. They went to Cuba for a bit. They fucking love Che. They love Che. They treat him like a saint, bro. Like they semi-pray to this guy.
American college kids think that he was edgy. Now, why does our culture ignore the evil of these revolutions?
Why they put Marx there? What did Marx do? Marx didn't do nothing, bro. He was, bro, his pen and shit.
Revolutionaries, because we have crippled ourselves by thinking that America was the big bad guy and everyone was just having a grand old time until America decided to flex its muscle.
Does this guy know nothing about the history of American imperialism? Take communism out of the equation. Prior to communism even being a factor here, American imperialism was still a persistent and pervasive issue, right? The colonization of the Philippines and the genocide that's transpired there, the theft of Hawaii, the theft of Puerto Rico, Nicaragua. These are issues that predate the inception of communist struggle in Latin America. So American imperialism is actually a massive issue here. It's a huge issue. I would say it's the crux of the majority of the issues that we face in the Western Hemisphere today. Are you still a libertarian socialist? I've always considered myself a Luxemburgist. I still do to this day. But I'm also very charitable to MLs. I'm not like an anti-ML guy, right? Like a lot of the people I look up to the most in life have been MLs. Che Guevara, like this past segment has been me debunking anti-Che Guevara slander. Fidel Castro is someone I look up to greatly. I also look up to Lenin. And funnily enough, Rosa Luxemburg thought very highly of Lenin. She had critiques of Lenin, and I share her critiques of Lenin, but ultimately she understood that Lenin and her wanted the same thing. They wanted what was best for the vast majority of people. There's one more video that is semi-related to this topic that someone sent to me, and I think it would be nice to just go over it.
Guys, look at this castle. 1745. How is it that a structure from the Spanish Empire, from Felipe V, the one who controlled one of the greatest empires where the sun never set, next to the British Empire, one of the most impressive and glorious reaches in this world, from Asia, from the Philippines, all the way to Guam, to Cuba, to all of the Caribbean, reaching down to Patagonia, and even up to parts of continental United States nowadays, Florida, Louisiana. They had it all, man. And it's in better shape, even though it's centuries older than the shit that's been going on here for the last 67 years. Unbelievable. It's in better shape. How?
Yeah, I thought this was funny. Someone sent it to me. Just this guy doing propaganda for the Spanish Empire while simultaneously shitting on Cuba. It's so funny because this lays bare, I think, the distinction between right-wingers and people of the left. Because this guy is very enamored by like the architecture of the Spanish Empire. And yeah, sure, it was very beautiful. You'll never catch this guy talking about the fact that Spanish conquistadors were actually inspired by a lot of indigenous architecture, like the bojijos of the Caribbean. But again, that's a different topic. This lays bare the distinction between the right and the left, I think, because he's very enamored by the architecture here. He loves it and actively overlooks all of the death and destruction that the Spanish Empire was responsible for. So a person of the left would probably think of the Spanish Empire and think about all of the loss of life it was responsible for, because I think people of the left prioritize lives. And people of the right, they don't. They prioritize empires, imperialism, property. And I think this lays that bare, because if someone was to bring up the Spanish Empire to me, the first thing I would do is think of the crimes of the Spanish Empire, right? The Cholula massacre, where Hernan Cortez killed about 7,000 people, and then when survivors would like crawl out from under the wreckage, he and his men would hack them to death. Right? Like this is what comes to mind. You could read more about that in Greg Grandin's America. There was the Cow massacre in Cuba, was carried out by Panfilo, I believe. And there was 3,000 people killed. Richard Gott touches on this in his book, Cuba, A New History. This massacre in particular was so horrid that Bartolomé de las Casas turned on his fellow conquistadors and actually appealed to the Spanish crown for better protections for indigenous people of the Americas. These are the things that I think of when I think of the Spanish Empire. I don't think about, wow, pretty building. These were mass murderers, right? Like the Spaniards, they were so incredibly brutal. They were cruel. They were beyond cruel. They would kill for sport. They would place bets on who could take a head clean off in a single blow. There's a passage from Stannard's American Holocaust that is pretty much burnt into my mind. If you give me a second, I can pull it up. Once the Indians were in the woods, the next step was to form squadrons and pursue them. And whenever the Spaniards found them, they pitilessly slaughtered everyone like sheep in a quarrel. It was a general rule among Spaniards to be cruel, not just cruel, but extraordinarily cruel, so that harsh and bitter treatment would prevent Indians from daring to think of themselves as human beings or having a minute to think at all. So they would cut an Indian's hands and leave them dangling by a shred of skin, and they would send him on saying, "Go now, spread the news to your chiefs." They would test their swords and their manly strength on captured Indians and place bets on the slicing off of heads or the cutting of bodies in half with one blow. They burned or hanged captured chiefs. The Spanish were notoriously so cruel that indigenous women would kill their children. Not just women, but indigenous people would commit like mass familial suicides and kill their children because they understood that being captured by the Spanish and suffering a death at the hands of the Spanish would be more painful, less dignified than just mass familial suicide. That's how horrible the Spanish Empire was. I think actually the worst anecdote I could think of right now is the fact that Spaniards, they would snatch newborn babies and they would use their swords as spits and roast the babies like rotisserie pigs over fires and force the mothers to watch. That's the Spanish Empire. Greg Grandin recounts that in the aforementioned America book. Again, it's just despicable to sit here, shit on Cuba, say, wow, whatever's been going on here for the past 67 years, fuck them, and then glaze the Spanish Empire. Because I guarantee you, if you talk to this guy about what his gripes with Cuba are, he would probably make up like a bunch of human rights violations. A lot of them, I say most of them, are probably just CIA propaganda. But then he'll sit here and he'll glaze the Spanish Empire, which is notorious for human rights violations on a scale that Castro and Che and the Cuban government couldn't even dream of coming close to, don't even have any aspiration to come close to. It's very interesting. I think this does lay bare the distinction between people of the left who actually care about life, human lives, and people of the right who care about legacy and conquest and empires and property.